Right, folks, we're sticking with 15 markers. I'm going to do a few more of the generic 15 markers that you could get asked. Some of these I imagine will cause you problems. Remember to check this 2022 advanced information. You might not get these ones if you're a second year student. First year students obviously could get any of these. But it's worthwhile just looking at these to go, right, who would I use? What do I know? How can I make this fit? The first one might seem, I don't think you'll get this question. I think they'll word it slightly more specifically towards a theory, but you might get a very generic question like that. Spectacular subcultures. Now, spectacular subcultures, you know, are going to be a culture within a culture. But, you know, these are going to be a visible one, ones that you can see, usually confrontational, okay? But, you know, you could say you can spot this particular subculture. Visible and confrontational. Now, we've got to find a way of shoehorning in some explanations for these. So, if I was doing the spectacular subculture one, I would go, right, well, which are the most spectacular subcultures I can think of? And the first one is going to be like skinheads, and I'm going to go Marxist, and I'm going to go exaggerate your masculinity, and I could do the skinheads, and I could do Clark, okay? So focusing on, you know, that idea of exaggeration. Remember, they exaggerate their working class values. Masculinity is, I suppose, one of those. So exaggerate your working class values. Masculinity is one of those, but community is another one. Skinheads works well for that one. You could keep it Marxist maybe for another paragraph and go punks. I know Firth looks at the punks and says it's resistance to capitalism and unemployment, which is very similar to what we're saying about the skinheads here. It's all as a response to capitalism. But you've got your ideas about bricolage and safety pins that the punks used, which is obviously going to be heritage. You could talk about low wages, unemployment and urban decay. You might find that this is enough to make 2 paragraphs out of it. You might like to do that. Or you might like to stick it all in one. That's not a problem. Third paragraph for spectacular subcultures, you could go to, again, it's all going to be about resistance, but this time it's going to be resistance to racism. And you might go to Savannah Dan, Hebditch, or even Gilroy to talk about Rasta. Okay, and when you could talk about their kind of response to white domination, white oppression, and potentially look at the you know, symbols of resistance like the dreadlocks that make them a highly visible subculture, and their kind of response to that. You could stick with ethnicity and look at Hall, policing the crisis, but because you've always got to try and link it back to ethnicity, you could look at Rude Boys as being the group that Hall might say have kind of emerged a little bit more frequently there, following on from policing the crisis, which is obviously that media moral panic. Last but not least, if you wanted to do feminism, you could go maybe Ladette or New Wave and look at resistance to the patriarchy. You could look at you know, gender convergence from the group study by Jackson, or New Wave, which is Blackman. Okay. So spectacular subcultures. I don't think you'd get it, but that would be your question. The consumerism one, I think people would find difficult, but consumerism for me, you're mainly going to be focusing on postmodernism. Okay, so your paragraph, I think maybe 1 and 2 would be looking at postmodernism and how consumerism leads to youth culture membership. You know, you can pick and choose your youth culture from the supermarket of style. So you can pick and choose the clothes that you wear. You don't have to have a meaning for them anymore. Polymus, it's all about you being a consumer here. And obviously one of the important things in consumerism is your identity, and obviously neo-tribes are built on consumerism. So Bennett and the Ravers are a good example, even though they're from a different background where Cage is irrelevant. What draws them together is consumer choices of drugs and rave music. Consumerism, I suppose, you could also say that capitalism is consumerism. So you could still bring in resistance to capitalism from a Marxist perspective, but only if you state that essentially capitalism has moved us to a consumer culture, and then groups form as a resistance to that consumer culture, which would be Marxist. So again, all your CCCS writers work. Finally, I suppose you could do Abrams from a functionalist perspective, who would say that youth culture is really, really important for the economy, so consumerism is a brilliant thing. And it's great that youth cultures exist based on consumerism, and that's why it's good for tax, that's why it's good for creating jobs, that's why it's good that you young people are the focus of most of the adverts and most of the media. So there's your top two. Now these are the three. If you're second year at the minute for 2022, these won't be coming up, or they shouldn't be coming up according to the advanced information. The relationship between deviancy and youth cultures. Now I'm hoping that is a really, really straightforward one, because all of the youth cultures are somewhat deviant, and all you've got to do is kind of pick out the kind of deviance and the reasons why. So if you've got a deviancy 15-mark question, you've got so much that you can write, because you could look at labels, and you could look at Becker and use Jock Young as the example. You could look at the impact of the media and use Stan Cohen's Mods and Rockers as an example. You could look at status frustration, and you could use the other Cohen, Albert Cohen, as an example. You could look at resistance to capitalism, and use the writers from the CCCS, my pen's dying, and they would cut it. You could do resistance to patriarchy, for girl gangs, Campbell and Denscombe. I'm trying to think if there's any more. I mean, Chambliss, I suppose, even Saints and the Roughnecks, they were behaving in a deviant way. So look, any of those will cut it. There's a lot that you've got to say there. Walter Miller, focal concerns would work for deviants, because they're involved in inevitable trouble on night out because of these different set of norms and values. So deviancy would be a great question. Note again that a response to labelling, that's your opening sentence, that's your point. Because of issues with their status in school, status frustration, there's your opening point. So make sure that you've got that first kind of idea at the top of that 50-mark paragraph. Remember, I've given you loads here. You only need 3 well explained. But if you're doing, resistance to the patriarchy, use Campbell and Denscombe together. Don't feel you've just got to limit it to just one writer. You can throw 2 in there, because it'll make the paragraph look a lot better if you do Becker and support it with Jock Young. If you do, Campbell and support Campbell with Denscombe. So that will work fine in there. Relationship between media and membership of youth culture. Any media questions, I think, is going to be not the best for youth culture, even though you will have all probably studied media. So if you get a media question, I would be saying that, look at the slow news day causing youth cultures to get involved in moral panics that lead to more criminality. And you could do Mods and Rockers by Cohen. And then you could talk even a little bit about, news values and requiring that to happen. Galtung and Rouge might be nice to throw in very, very quickly in a 15-marker to support that. You could talk about, distracting from capitalism, if you did Stuart Hall, and Policing the Crisis. Remember, these are all moral panics, but you just kind of aim in the point, the explanation in a different way. Then you could just look at a downright response to labelling, and you could do Jock Young, maybe even backed up with Becker, to show the hippies in very similar fashion to the way that you might do up here. Their label of dirty, lazy druggies led to an increase in deviance, and those groups ended up taking heroin. Media, I think, would be the question that I would be steering away from for 15 marks and for 35 marks from youth culture as well. Don't think there's much to get your teeth into there. Last one, education. Now, I know a lot of you have done this question, I believe. And on the previous videos, you'll see that some of these youth learning to labour. It's because of capitalism that these 12 working class boys are going to fail, and therefore they join an anti-school subculture because they don't think they can do any better, and they're going to mess around at school, call the other kids ear holes, be unpleasant, be aggressive, because they're going to get the same kind of working class job that their parents did. You got Mackingale with the crisis of masculinity, and obviously the crisis of masculinity leading to the formation of the macho lads in school. You got Sewell again with the rebel lads and their resistance to teacher racism. You've got Ladettes by Jackson and resistance to the patriarchal kind of norms. And also you could support that with Emma Reynolds, an idea that girls in school exaggerate their femininity. Okay, so exaggerated femininity is the short skirts, makeup, dating older boys as a form of resistance against against the school, against the traditional ideas of what a female should be like. And then look, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, and you don't even then have to give labelling, and you could do Chambliss and the Saints and Roughnecks. You could still do status frustration from Cohen. I don't think they're as good as the top ones, but they would also fit this kind of question. So, we're almost done now. I'm going to do this the final lot of questions that I think should be straightforward. But these, again, you're using quite a bit of your knowledge on these potential topic questions. Now, here are a breakdown of some of the other questions that you could get. These are the theory questions for 15 marks. Youth acts as a bridge, labelling, concept of a neo-tribe, resistance to capitalism, resistance to the patriarchy. They're all going to be from within Marxism, interactionism, postmodernism, functionalism, interactionism, postmodernism, Marxism and feminism respectively. You will only be able to talk about those theories, okay, if you get that question. They're not topics. However, if let's say you could still explain how youth cultures might act as a form of resistance, so ignore the to capitalism bit. You've got then Marxism for resistance to capitalism, you've got feminism for resistance to the patriarchy, and then you could do Sewell, you could do Savannah Van Hedge or Gilroy for resistance to racism. So that would still be a topic question. But all of these 15 markers, you can only talk about the theory that they're associated with. So there's not much else that potentially, that you could, well, there isn't anything else you're going to get marks for if you go out of those theories. For functionalism, a bridge, Durkheim, social integration, Walsh, going from child to adulthood to prevent anarchy, Parsons, rite of passage, detach from your parents, take on mild responsibility, shape your identity outside the home, Eisenstadt, move from the scribe to achieve status with your peer group whilst you blow off steam, which is a safety valve. You need to know that. Labelling, Becker and Young, labels affect behaviour. Cohen, the media labels affect formation of youth cultures. Mods and Rockers, Chambliss, teacher labels affect performance and then behaviour and job roles in the future with the Saints and Roughnecks. Those are 3 paragraphs there. For neo-tribes, consumerism, but you need to talk first about Cage being irrelevant, Bennett and Hetherington, fragmented society, Hetherington. So you join a neo-tribe according to Bennett, such as the Ravers, where consumerism is important, polymer supermarket style. Those would be 3 paragraphs. Resistance to capitalism, break, Hall and Jefferson Clark, maybe Corrigan in there to support Clark, and explain how youth cultures might act as a form of resistance to the patriarchy, new wave, Ladettes, girl gangs would be your explanations for those. Those would be your 15 markers, your theory questions. You've got to know that content. So I think those will work for the 2, for almost any 15 mark question that you could get. I can't think of many more. And remember, check the advanced information to ensure that your area could be tested in the exam. Make sure that you're revising the right stuff. However, that being said, if you are a second year at the minute and in 2022 with the advanced information, you will, unlikely to get an education question. That's what it says, but you're still going to use the ladettes, so you need to know them. You could still get a labelling question where you need Chambliss. Stage frustration works for class, it works for, works for lots of things. If you get a question on masculinity, Mac and Gale works, even Sewell works for that. Ladettes would work for that if you talk about gender convergence being important for females. So it's so holistic, you really need to know everything. But you maybe don't need to spend your time worried about those 15 mark questions, just make sure that you know the content.